Bishop Kennedy and I are going to make some prepared remarks. And one of our alumni from last year's program is Father Chris Peschel, who is either so enamored of what happened last year or a glutton for punishment that he's back. And but I want him to tell a little bit of his story as a result of last year's program. And then later this afternoon, his classmate from Philadelphia will be up as well, who was also part of the program last year. So let me just kick off with two anecdotes. I was teaching a course for Fordham in the graduate education program, and they have a Catholic school leadership program, and they have satellite programs, and one of them was in Brooklyn at Bishop Ford High School. And before getting into the priestly component of it, I should mention this. I was guided to the classroom that we were going to use for the semester, and the vice principal was taking me around, and I said, "How is enrollment?" And she said, "We're in very serious trouble." What happened? What do you mean? She said, "We budgeted for 500 freshmen, and only 200 showed up in September." I said, "What happened?" She said, "A charter high school opened down the block." And within a year, Bishop Ford High School was closed. So sometimes people, and we'll talk about this afternoon about financial considerations, sometimes people involved in the school choice movement like to promote the charter operation as sort of a camel's nose in the tent for us to get more. But we need to be very, very careful about that, because that is the camel's nose in the tent, not for us to get more, but for us to lose students. All right? At any rate, the first day of the class, coincidentally, was the feast of Cardinal Newman. And I said to these future Catholic school principals, you know, many of you know about Cardinal Newman's involvement with universities, but are you aware of his involvement with elementary and secondary schools? So much so that when the Archbishop of Melbourne, Australia, was having a problem with public support for Catholic schools, he called on Newman to lend support to the effort in Australia even. So, and no one knew that. And there's I wrote a paper. In fact, the Cardinal Newman, the Newman Studies program had an annual convention here at Seton Hall 3 years ago, and I did a presentation precisely on Newman with elementary and secondary schools. And I'd be happy to share the paper with you. And what's interesting about it is, even as a cardinal, he continued to teach in the oratory school in Birmingham. He ran the plays, and he had a part in the school band as a cardinal. He prepared the kids for the state exams. And and people are generally unaware of this. And they have testimonies from the so-called old boys, the alumni of the school, talking about, among whom was Tolkien, and that, you know, they remember this bent over old man with a red beretta scurrying across the campus to make sure that he was preparing the kids for the National Latin exam and so forth. So if a 90-year-old cardinal can do it, I think the average priest can do it as well. At any rate, I made this point, and I said, could you people reflect on the relationship of priests to your schools? 4 of the teachers of these master's candidates were in high schools, and 13 were in elementary schools. And the 4 in the high schools, and we're talking about very large high schools, upwards of 1,500 kids, not one had a full-time priest. And as a matter of fact, they were reduced to what I call rent-a-priest. So, you know, the sacramental magician that we hire to come in to do what no one else can do, which is obviously completely alien to a Catholic ecclesiology and sacramentology. Then I said, well, what about the elementary schools? And one woman said, well, we had an absolutely terrible pastor for the past 5 years. He hated the school, wanted nothing to do with it. And she said, and we sang a Te Deum because he was moved. And when the new pastor was appointed, but he had arrived, she called him and said, Father, we're so happy to hear you're coming to our parish school, and we want you to know that the door is open for you anytime, any day. Visit classrooms, teach religion in the upper grades if you want, any kind of prayer services, let alone Mass. And there was an awkward pause, and she said, Father, are you there? He said, don't get your hopes up. And so the experience of 17 Catholic educators was not an iota of priestly involvement in their schools. 17 schools, no priest is seriously involved in any way. And as a matter of fact, imagine the attitude, don't get your hopes up. So with that in mind, how did we get to this stage? A number of years ago, I'm going to say probably about 30, going to the point that both Steve and Tom made about the so-called clergy crunch, and bishops supposedly having to make a decision about whether or not to have, let's say, a priest in high school work versus the priest as a parochial vicar, or even as a pastor. And I remember, and again, this was an incremental process, exactly like with the closures, clusterings, whatever euphemism we want to use. But bishops first said, well, I have to start yanking some priests from schoolwork, so we'll take them out of teaching any secular subjects. All right. Now, I knew that this was a bad idea because for most of my career in high school work, I taught secular subjects. I taught English, I taught French, I taught Latin, psychology, and journalism. And I remember one time I had all of the freshmen for religion and half of the freshmen also for English. And at the end of the year, I said to one of the boys, Mike, you were very lucky. You had me 2 periods a day. Which class did you enjoy more, English or religion? And he said, well, to be perfectly honest, Father, he said, I think I learned more religion from you in English class than I did in religion class. Smart aleck answer. And I was kind of cut to the quick about that because I was in the process of upgrading the whole religion department. And I thought, then I went home that night and I did a little more reflecting, and I said, well, no, actually, that's why we have a Catholic school. Precisely because you can teach religion in an English class, or in a French class, or in a Latin class, or a history class. And parenthesis, he's one of the 7 boys that I sent to the seminary who became a priest. And so this was the first strategic error made by bishops, all right? Secondly, they then said, well, all right, we won't have them teaching secular subjects, but they'll still teach religion classes. Well, then, of course, we started having more personnel problems. And so, no, well, we'd have the priest to be the chairman of the religion department. And, well, now we needed him now also. So now, well, we'll have the priest just be the chaplain. And now we're at the point where many of those are not even there. And well, I say myopic for this reason, because precisely, and people have made this point repeatedly in the past 2 days, the presence of the priest is in direct proportion to production of vocations to the priesthood. And so the short-term solution was, I need a collar over here, so yank him from there. But what was happening, of course, was precisely that we were now taking someone from an institution who had been helping to produce priests, and now there was a vacuum there. I was, a classmate of mine from high school lives in Atlantic City, and every so often he'll say, come on down for dinner. We don't go to the casinos, but they have some good restaurants. And we went into a restaurant, a mafia type place, and that you have to, pass through the bar to get to the restaurant. And nobody quite talks to anybody there, kind of watching. And it was a good meal. And as we're walking out, had to walk through the bar, and the bartender said, "Father, are you a new priest at St. Nicholas?" And I said, No. I said, "I'm just visiting. This is a friend of mine from high school." And he said, oh, because I heard a new priest was coming to St. Nicholas. I said, no, I'm not he. And he said, because my baby brother just entered the seminary. And I said, oh, where? He said, Seton Hall. And I said, oh, college or theology? He said, college. And I said, oh, great. I said, what school did he go? What high school did he go to? He said, Holy Spirit. And I said, Absecon, because my high school, my alma mater, played theirs when I was a kid. And he said, oh, I said, was your brother the first in a long line of kids to finally enter the seminary from high school? And he said, no, actually, he said, there are 4 boys in the past 5 years from that school who have gone into college seminary. And I said, well, to what do you attribute that? And he said, we had a great priest who was the principal. I said, you use the past tense. He said, yeah, the bishop yanked him and said he needed him more in a parish. Now, is this logical? What could be in anybody's head? A school has produced 4 boys in 5 years. Would we not connect the dots and say, perhaps the man who's running the school is responsible for this? Didn't see it. Now, there was a new bishop in the diocese who actually has reinstated priests into the high schools. And you start to see, again, a turnaround. There's a change in the mood. Another anecdote takes place in New England. There is a bishop who was a professional educator. And he and I were having a conversation a few years ago when we started this seminar, so 3 years ago. And he said, it's really important, it's very important. And he himself, before becoming a bishop, was very involved in Catholic education. And he said, I'm going to tell you why a priest is so important. He said, we had a parish in this diocese when I came. The parish itself should have been closed 40 years ago, but it was never done. And miraculously, the school was never closed, and it was down to 50 or 60 kids. And it was constantly on the chopping block, but constantly evaded the noose in one way or another. And he said, so I called in a young priest, a couple of years ordained, and I said, Father, how would you like to go to be the administrator at St. So-and-so's school, at parish? And the young guy said, what did I do to hurt you? And he said, well, yeah, the place has its challenges. And he said, but Bishop, I don't want to be the guy that's closing it. I'm 29 years old. I don't want to go there and close an institution. And he said, well, why don't you go with a different attitude? He said, I would never dream of forcing anybody to take an assignment he doesn't want. But think about it this way. If you go there and it fails, no one will blame you, because everybody will say, it should have closed 40 years ago anyway. Right? He just put the ribbon on the package. Right? On the other hand, if you build it up, and it survives and even might thrive, he said, this would be a feather in your cap, huh? And a very good experience. So the fellow thought about it, he called him back, he said, okay, I'll try it. And he made his priority the school. He stood at the front door of the school every morning as kids got off the buses, greeted every child. They had lauds in the school gym every morning. They then went to class. He assumed the teaching of religion full-time in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. He was on the playground at recess. He was in the cafeteria at lunch. And as the kids left the school at the end of the day, getting on the buses, he made the sign of the cross on every kid's head getting on the bus. In one semester, 60 went to 120. By the end of the year, it was up to 200. Right? And the school saved the parish. Right? Because people were coming there for the school and then said, this is a vibrant place. This is something is going here, okay? And so I think we need to put that, but again, it's the key person there is what? It's the priest. And Charles was very, very kind about not telling horror stories that he endured with problematic pastors who were, and until finally, he and I convinced the bishop, you can't put a priest into a parish that has a school if he doesn't want to be part of a school. And what, your last 2 years as superintendent, you had relative peace because you had every pastor of a parish with a school wanted to be there. And so, what are we talking about? We're talking about every priest doesn't have to have a graduate degree in education, but he ought to be able to teach the basics of the faith. Huh? And I always have believed that, again, the old Philly policy about every priest being in high school work for 5 years, if you can teach hormone-raging teenagers for 5 years, you can do anything, all right? And when a priest says, you know, I learned all this theology and now these kids are not interested, and I say, wait a minute, Father, if you can't explain this concept to a sophomore in high school, it means one of two things. Either you don't understand it yourself or you don't believe it yourself. And it's the best training. And you never can get off script. If you're in teaching kids, starting particularly with junior high into high school, if they're trying to blow air, they pick it up very, very quickly. And they'll tell you quickly, Father, you really didn't know what you're talking about today, did you? You weren't prepared. And they may like you or even love you as a person and as a priest, but they're going to be brutally honest. And again, it affects your homiletic style because you're not going to go and blow wind in the pulpit on Sunday, because preparation is key to what you're doing all week long, because you're preparing your lessons, even if it's something as simple as teaching second graders about the Trinity. Actually, try to teach second graders about the Trinity, all right? And that's good preparation for every other aspect of priestly ministry. But then also, I alluded to it a bit yesterday, the role of the priest in helping to form the faculty, ongoing formation of faculty, theological and spiritual formation. We can't take these things for granted. I said yesterday that I think the average, and more than average, Catholic school teacher today is a person of immensely goodwill, but often enough not sufficiently formed. And that's our job as priests, to do that work. Also, the whole question of hiring a faculty. This is not something that can be delegated to a principal. Principal obviously has to be involved in the process, but you are intimately involved because, again, a point that some superintendents don't like to be reminded of, if it's a parish school, the pastor is the superintendent. The superintendent has no authority over a parish school. The bishop has very little authority over a parish school, right? It's the pastor who is the superintendent. And so a hiring policy, and I have a form which I've put together, which I'll give you later today, of 15 or 20 questions to ask a potential teacher about that individual's personal faith life. How do you see yourself involved in the overall mission of the church? Specifically, how do you see a Catholic elementary school or secondary school? What do you see your role as? Who are some of your favorite Catholic educators? Well, who? What? These are questions that, and they're off the cuff as far as these people are concerned. They're not prepared for those questions. And if they're not prepared and they don't have the instinct to answer properly, you're going to get either a lot of silence or some awfully bad answers. But I've often maintained, people talk about the annulment process being Catholic divorce. I happen not to think that, because one of the areas where I do agree with Pope Francis is I think the vast majority of marriages contracted in the past 40 years are invalid because you have people, baptized pagans, who have no concept of marriage, let alone the basics of sacraments and life in the church. And as a matter of fact, we have teachers who are teachers, but to be a teacher, you first of all have to be a disciple. And so what's your own personal commitment to Christ and to the church? and that's going to influence how you teach. And so the hiring process, I believe, is critically, just as I think the marriage preparation and screening out of people is critically important. Before, you won't have the annulment process. If you tighten up on the marrying end, you won't have the problem at the other end. Similarly, with the business of hiring of teachers, if we're very, very careful about whom we hire, we don't have a problem then about having a loose cannon on deck in the school and eventually having to say to someone, you know, it's probably time you go search for a better position somewhere else. And then also deciding who enters the school as students. I always had the policy, we did not register children, we registered families in a school. To emphasize the point that, number one, parents are the primary educators of their children, and you're not dumping your child on us, all right? We are continuing a process that you hopefully have begun. Now, maybe you haven't begun it, but then at least that you're in sync with us in moving ahead, and you're not in opposition. Many dioceses now have what they call a covenant document that parents sign before putting their kid into the school. And I got so tired after years of parents saying, Johnny was in public school for 9 years, he's a mess, and you have my permission to whack him anytime you want, right? And I said, this is not a reformatory, all right? If you haven't done your job for 9 years, don't expect us to do this, all right? And, but we're willing to be part of the process. And then the question about, again, what kinds of kids are admitted? And this is getting dicier by the year. As I mentioned to you at Vespers last night, you know, I was admitted to a Catholic school at a moment when many times kids wouldn't be because my parents were divorced and remarried. But a decision was made that, all right, we'll work with the kid, and maybe through the kid, we'll work up with the parents, which is exactly what happened. But now, I mean, it gets even more confusing and problematic when we start talking about children of same-sex parents. What is, do we have a policy? And this can't be flying by the seat of the pants, huh? You may remember, it was about 3 years ago, out in LA, the Norbertines have that wonderful St. Michael's Abbey out there with their prep school, but they also run 2 grammar schools, parish grade schools. And a couple, a same-sex couple, went to the principal and said, we would like to put our son in the parish school. And the principal, good. And so she said, well, let me do a little research. And she called the pastor, and he said, well, let's all meet together. And so he said to the 2 guys, look, you know what the Catholic Church teaches and believes about this issue. Are you willing to submit your child to a school where that's what he's going to be taught, all right? Number one. And number two, and we don't want to punish the child for what you're doing, okay? We're hoping that, you know, by accepting the child into the school, that the child will come to a blossoming of Catholic faith. But the second shoe has to drop as well. You can't say or do anything that's going to be scandalous to the other children or families in the school. And if you can agree to that, then we can move it forward here. And the kid was in the school for a couple of years. And then there was, I don't know, a Christmas concert or something. And Adam and Steve decided to kiss each other at the concert. And the whole thing blew up. And of course, the pastor and principal said, you know, sorry. Oh, you're punishing our kid. No, you chose to do that. You did it, all right? But again, there needs to be a policy in place. And so whether that is, there is a diocesan policy, and I think that needs to be in place to protect pastor and principal, all right? Because didn't Boston have a problem with that a year or 2 ago?
About 4 years.
Yeah. And so, you know, if you have it there, at least everybody knows it and it's clear, and it doesn't look like it's an ad hoc decision that's being made. So all of these are areas that are, you know, rife for the involvement of a priest, and in my judgment, very, very necessary for them. Huh? Bishop, do you want to?
Yeah, okay, so I've been involved in education from beginning my priesthood, and it has been, I came out of an interesting high school background. I worked with seminary in Boston. They sent me to study at the Victorian. Among my main professors were Vernon Monaghan and Lockwell. It was an amazing time at the Victorian University. And so when I came back to Boston, my first assignment was a parish up in the New Hampshire borders, in Monica's parish. The pastor was running a great school, and the nuns of Notre Dame taught there. And, it was a vibrant place, still remains a very vibrant school, it's full, and it has, it's an integrated relationship, as Peter's been talking about, between the parish and the school and all of the other organizations in the parish. So that this was one of the things that seemed to me to be extraordinary in the way in which we're talking about the school becomes an agent of evangelization, because it was a way in which you not only had parents involved, but you had older brothers and sisters, you had relatives, you had alumni, you had a whole community that was consistent over time, and also in which they had a common, that, to put it this way, everybody really knew everybody else. This was the amazing thing. Anyway, I started doing my graduate work at Boston University. I took my day off to study, and I eventually got a doctoral degree in theology. And in that whole process, one of the things that was of concern to me were the questions: how do we deal with the issues that were so prominent in theology at that particular time, of the relation between doctrines and praxis? And this is because this, of course, remains a very great concern in the church and in education, and in the way in which we both engage those who are studying different practices. Because that, it seems to me, a seminary is a very important place in which we begin to open up in the understanding of a person's vocation, a sense between the fact that they are being called and that sense that they have a relationship with God that has a very deep intimacy. And at the same time, it is also a calling which has to engage their intelligence, their freedom, their love, their imagination, and so forth. In other words, it has to develop full interiority of the priest. And I think some of these things that Father Peter's been talking about is that we have difficulties because, in a certain sense, the understanding of the way a priest is a priest is going to have an enormous impact upon whether he is going to be able to engage in this missionary activity and evangelization from within the schools, and also how he's going to do that. And one of the things that I have found very helpful is thinking about how in education, Catholic education, we have an entire education system in the United States. It goes from kindergarten, preschool, all the way up through postgraduate. It's amazing. And what has been interesting to me, and this is an interesting question, I think, for the ongoing formation of teachers, is the issue of how our graduate programs need themselves to be ordered in such a way that they can help to form the teachers for our grade schools and our high schools. And so maybe something you would see in Paul is something that would be very, very, very valuable.
Just to make a point with Dr. Gillette, when she was part of the search process, when they were searching for a dean, what impressed a number of people on the search committee was she was the only candidate for the deanship who asked two questions. One, what does the School of Education of Seton Hall do for the Catholic schools of New Jersey? And secondly, what is the Catholic identity of the School of Education? And they said, wow, these are bizarre questions to be asking in a Catholic university, huh? And I think in large measure, this tipped everything in her direction, right? And she really is very, very strong on it. You saw, repeatedly. So I'm sorry, but I think that's the point, though, is what are we doing? We have these, 200 so-called Catholic colleges in the country, many of them with teacher training programs. And what's Catholic about it? When I went to Fordham to get my doctorate in education, there was not a single course in Catholic philosophy of education. I had a course in public school law, public school finance, nothing to do with what I was going to do as a priest in running Catholic schools.
So I've given you three handouts. The first of them relates then to this matter of having this broad educational system, which is capable of nourishing itself sometimes from below up, sometimes from above down. And so the one that I'm thinking of, first of all, is the one that's called the Humanistic Studies Program. This is a very interesting little program that was begun at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame in the 1950s. I'll give you a little account of it right there at the beginning. And it was started by Professor Bruno Schlesinger, who was an Austrian teacher of education, but who was also greatly influenced by Christopher Dawson. Why is Christopher Dawson so important? Because Christopher Dawson was a cultural historian. I would say Dawson is parallel to Cardinal Newman, in the sense that Newman had understood the crucial nature of the relationship between doctrines and history, or between the doctrine and the practical unfolding of how it is that people enter into faith, how that faith shapes the way they live, how it is that they are able to become a good apologist for it, and so forth. Dawson comes about 30 years after Newman. And he is really, in a sense, as much connected with the formation of Vatican II as Newman. You will notice that of the 16 documents in Vatican II, 13 of them refer to the question about culture. This was never an issue before. In the same way that the issue of the unfolding in history of doctrinal development and so forth that Newman had understood, and the way of it, how education works, was never really as thoroughly understood until that time. Although you get great insights from, as Peter was talking to me the other day about the insights from the late 19th, early 20th century popes on education. So Dawson is very important. And what were Dawson's insights? Dawson's insights were this: that every culture is shaped by a religion. It's the spiritual vision that is at the core of the creation of all of the elements that form civilization, and in a way begin to open up or close down the way in which people are able to recognize what is ultimate in their lives, and what the relationship of the whole world is within itself and to humans and to God. Dawson's first book, 1928, was called The Ages of the Gods. And it goes back to all the early religions to show how this principle works. And then he began his work on Christianity, and how it was in Christianity that the transformation of culture, particularly as it came from both within the Jewish tradition and then also within the Greek and Roman tradition, the humanistic tradition. How it was that the community began to be able to understand how the incarnation and the mystery of the death and resurrection are the dynamism that shaped the vision of people's lives in the way in which they can understand all of the institutions they need in order to be able to become fully human. This begins, of course, as Dawson says, one of the most important moments of this is Benedict's rule. Benedict order. It's the business of prayer and work, and it's the business, of course, of the great understanding of the need that the Benedictines had to establish the little schools connected with their monastery. Dawson then goes on to show, okay, well, how was it that Christianity began to create the culture of Europe and the West? And he wrote these books on the European, the making of Europe, and so forth. There's several books on education and the relationship to culture and faith. And so all of that was there. And St. Mary's College, not Notre Dame, was the one that put together this program, and you can see it there, the Humanities Studies, in which the whole sense of Dawson's understanding of the way in which the sciences, the way in which literature, the way in which history, the way in which understanding of religion and theology and liturgy and so forth, all come to interrelated and integrated structure. In other words, translating the sacramental order into the everyday life of every ordinary human being. So that's the first thing. The second one that I want to bring to your attention is teaching religion to young children. This comes from a little book that was published on the work of Maria Montessori. And this was, published by people in St. Paul, Minnesota in the 1950s, as well as this program had begun in the 50s at St. Mary's. This little thing about teaching religion to children is a fascinating account of allowing what I think is so important, and this is what priests must do, and this is why we listen. Everybody says we must listen. Yeah, but we have to listen in a certain way. We have to listen in a way that is capable of being patient. Because what the Montessori system understands is that there is a dynamism. Every child has a dynamism. This is part of the anthropology, the Catholic anthropology. There is a dynamism that is part of their being created. And that dynamism is a dynamism manifested by a quest, manifested by a negotiation with the unfolding of the organic structures of the body, of the interrelationship of the senses. So you have this thing in Montessori, which relates to me to what Bernard Lonergan called, when he started to talk about what is really important about theology in our times, is that there are 2 or 3 stages of meaning. There's ordinary common sense, which describes religion the way it appears to us. There's theology, which is concerned to understand what things are in themselves. And then there is interiority, which is the center that is really the integrator between ordinary common sense, ordinary descriptive knowledge, and the knowledge of scientific theology, which then is able to be translated into a way of life. This is what Montessori, I think, is so important, and I think that this is why I said, priests need to be attentive to their own vocations in order to be able to understand how they are, what their presence, what kind of presence is really needed in Catholic schools. Because they bring to they bring to the whole experience of the parish, the Catholic school system mentioned that the Eucharist, of course, is the very center, and it's the priest who is the one who brings the presence of Christ daily into the parish world, into the school world. And so the priest then, at best, I think, can translate that divine presence into a way of responding to the emerging presence of a child and to the presence that exists within teachers. So the teacher formation, it seems to me, has to go back to try to reopen what was always so much very important part of Catholic life, which Dawson saw as being so central to being able to shape a culture. And that is meditation and contemplation. Being able to have that sense of being with God, and to being with God in a way that allows one to bring to life what God has given us. And I will say that I think, as I mentioned earlier, if we're going to be a missionary community, we need to know exactly into what we have to speak on mission. So let me just say two things and I'll close with this. One of the things that is so crucial today, and first of all, we have to understand, Dawson understood already in the 1950s that the secularist thing was taking over, and he said either it will be a secularist spirit that will govern the future of the way our institutions are created, or it will be Jesus. It will be our sense of the mystery of the incarnate God. And he said, yeah, it's not looking so good. Flannery O'Connor in the 1950s saw that one of the problems in imagination, Catholic imagination, was that it had no access to the kind of interior dynamism of the experience of grace. And O'Connor would often say when she's writing these wacky stories about evil, the power of evil to annihilate the good, she's saying, sometimes we can only understand grace when we understand its absence. So I think that we have to understand what's been coming down the pipe for quite some time. Two things, one of them, I think it's the most important, is that the secular culture has deliberately been engaged for the last 150 years of annihilating the mega stories that are at the center of religious and Christian life. It's taken time for that structure that they've created to do its work, but it is now in full blossom. The mega stories are the account of everything from the beginning to the end. For us, the mega story is the Old and New Testament. It defines us. If we want an identity, we find it in there. We find it in the context of the openness in the story of Abraham to the mystery of he's living in a culture. The culture is a culture of death. And he wants to find a way out because it's natural dynamism is at work. And the quest of Abraham is met by the call of God. There's a synchronicity between the quest and the call. From Abraham until the ascension and the assumption and the promise of the eschatological return. That's our mega story. There were little mega stories along the way that nations created, such as in French, the Song of Roland, English, the King Arthur, Germans, the Nibelungen, but you had also the Iliad and the Odyssey, those are little mega stories. Virgil's Aeneid, little mega story. So we were accustomed to these kinds of epics that would give account of so much of our data. So these have all been eliminated by and large. Sadly, I mean, because for us, and this is the medical thing, yeah, sadly, the Protestants who were so concerned about the protection of the biblical megastory have basically surrendered to the secular minor stories. And so it is no longer faith, scripture, grace alone, it's cultural. And we see what's happening. So the mega stories, and so one of the things priests need to be aware of is the crucial way in which they are protectors of our mega story, and we have to get our teachers to become better protectors of our mega story. And to realize that that's where one of the cultural wars is at the present time. And the second thing I would say is the importance of the understanding that for the priesthood itself, in a secular and materialistic society, the priest has to understand the kind of suffering that he is going to undergo in the way of allowing faith and allowing the protection of the revelation, which is the task of the church, one fundamental and important way. Yeah, the priest is going to suffer because the secular society not only says, yeah, the mega story is nuts, but it also says the priesthood is insane. And the effort to destroy the priesthood is one of the principal projects of the secular order. They've destroyed, by and large, the ministries in Protestant churches. I don't know. I think one of the worst things that is going to come is when there are no more Jews. Because there we will have lost then the presence of part of the megastory. So we need to understand there is a suffering here that needs to be recognized, and I think one of the things that Charles said, and Tom said, and Steve said, is that there is a community, that the priesthood is not just isolated off of itself. It's part of the issue of the megastory is that the priest is always bound to the people and to the parish. The children in the schools. And you look at that magazine that came out from the schools that we saw. And yeah, maybe things aren't going along so well in some of the way, in some cases, but there are the pictures with all the graduates and the priest, some of the faculty. So the presence of the priest in the Catholic world is so absolutely crucial, and it also contains within it this kind of suffering that we know that we have to bear as part of our being related to our life, and that we can anticipate it and not be afraid of it, and that we have. I like the title that Peter was mentioning yesterday about when he was in the 3rd grade. Reading about the saints. The title was God's Friends and Ours Too. It's the communion of saints. That's what we have to build.
I mentioned that yesterday about Edith Stein, talking about building the communion of saints. When the bishop was talking about the cultural vacuum, I don't know if any of you saw one of the new cardinals, Aurelius from Sweden. So wonderful, wonderful man. And he gave a great interview to Catholic World Report. And as you probably know, Scandinavia is about as secular as you can get anything now. And there's never been a sexploit that they haven't tried in the past 55 years. But there's a great growth of Catholicism in Scandinavia, and in particular in Sweden. And the cardinal was asked, to what do you attribute that? He said, our culture has gone so far down that they're now willing to accept the narrative of Christianity for the first time in 500 years.
By the way, he was involved with, I've known him for some time because we created at the University of St. Thomas, where I taught for 32 years, a Catholic Studies program. And one of the things was he found out, and he came over, and he went and met with us to see how can I translate this into my work as the Archbishop of Stockholm.
Yeah. But I think this is the interesting thing. I'll talk about this in the homily tomorrow, but in regard to chastity issues with kids. But I think we're so nowhere near Scandinavia in the abyss. But the lower we get, in some sense, the easier it's going to be to preach the Christian message, because there'll be it's what really happened at the end of the Roman Empire. It was such a mess; it could only get better, and so people were willing to start to listen. When you've got a residual Christianity that's there, these people don't believe they need conversion, and that you're the one that's out of sync. Real quick, Father Chris, I know you don't want to keep people from lunch, but
I never like to stand between people. But Father Peter asked me to give some comments based on having attended last year's conference in Philadelphia and things that I did practically as a parish priest returning back to work in the parish that I was in and in the diocese that I was in. I realize I'm giving these comments with my diocesan superintendent to my left and my seminary rector to my right.
a rose between two thorns.
To be bluntly honest, a year ago I was at this conference. There was an ongoing kind of study task force of Catholic education going on in my diocese, and a lot of what was going on was not exactly known to me, but the few things that I was hearing, I was not particularly happy to hear about, because it seemed like the direction things were going in were really minimizing the role of the priest. And it seemed as if things were getting the priest to a minimal place in the school, a minimal place in the governance structure. And it had kind of concerned me to a degree. And I was a parochial vicar of a parish on Cape Cod that had a school of about 225 students. I had been there at that point for 2 years. I had completed a third year there just this past July. And since arriving there, was very involved in the school. Now, as parochial vicar, I really didn't have anything going on in the administrative end of the school. I wasn't involved in hiring. I wasn't involved in governance of any sort. I was more of a chaplain, so to speak, to that school. And at my arrival, the pastor of the school, who was also very involved there, he said to me, he said, "You can be involved as much or as little at the school as you want." He really left that ball in my court. So once school opened at the end of that first summer, I decided every day I'm here, I'm going there. And it became the simple thing of going, as Father Peter alluded to another story of a priest in New England, just going simply at the beginning of the day and the end of the day to meet kids, to meet their families as they're dropping them off, or to meet them as they're getting off the bus. And during the day, to be present at the times when they were free or out of the classroom, at recess, at lunch. And then over time, it built up to, once the teachers got to recognize me and know who I was, getting into the classroom, teaching from time to time, reading biblical stories to the younger kids, and getting as involved as possible with the school. So when I had kind of heard ruminations of things kind of moving out of the priest's hands and whatever might have been going on at that time, I thought that this, this opportunity to come to the workshop last year was going to be of particular benefit, and it proved to be. And so I came and I spent the time at St. Charles in Philadelphia, and really between the lectures that we heard and the notes that I was able to take, as well as the handouts, that came with us, I was able to go back, and I was sitting at the dinner table with my pastor, who knew that I had come down to here, and he said to me, so what'd you do? What was it all about? And I said, hold on a second. And I went and got the packet of information and just kind of went through. And I had actually gotten duplicates for him so that he could look through everything.
Yeah, take as much of this as you want, because otherwise it's going to land at the door when we leave tomorrow. So.
And he said to me, after hearing me talk, after seeing some of the things that I handed out, he said, you really need to tell the bishop about this. And I said, okay. He said, yes, sooner than later. You need to tell the bishop about this. And I said, what do you think I should do? He said, here's his email address. Put it all in an email and send it to him. And so I did. I mean, here I was, 2 years ordained, sitting in front of my computer and writing out probably a 5-page summary of everything we had done for the week and just my take on things, and really going at the importance and necessity of the role of the priest in the school, indicating to him kind of expressly and intently my desire to be involved in the schools, and just how formative Catholic schools had been in my own life, having gone for all of grammar school, 4 years of high school. And I said, I think it's important to keep the priest's presence in the school. I think it's important to be deliberate in your assignments of priests. I didn't know how he would receive it. And he got back to me actually that same day. And he said, this is a lot to unpack, but thank you for this. I appreciate it very much. And I appreciate your willingness really to be involved in the schools and your expressed desire. And that was just kind of how it was left. And that was last summer. And then school started back up again for this past academic year. And I just continued the routine that I was in, except that I added some things that I thought would be of greater benefit to the school that I really hadn't been doing. And that's things along the lines of Eucharistic adoration, First Friday devotions, things that I thought the kids could be exposed to. We already had confessions on a regular basis and Mass on a regular basis. We're just incorporating some of the devotionals and other sacramentals into the life of the school to help bring that sense there. One of the things that I also ended up doing over this past year, and it's probably an attribute to my kind of craziness and unwillingness to say no to some things, especially involving schools, was I reached out to the grammar school that I went to, the one really where my own journey of faith and life of faith began. And I knew, because we've kind of heard the narrative that there are some priests that don't want to be involved in education, I knew that the pastor of that school was not particularly involved in the school. And so I reached out to them and ended up connecting with one of my old teachers who was working in the school for the specific role of increasing Catholic identity. And through conversations with her and with the principal, we worked out a schedule wherein basically once a month on my day off, I was in teaching in that school, the very one that I went to. And, I was introducing them similarly to things like adoration, confessions, things that they had never really done before. And it got to the point where at the end of this last school year, when that, the school, that grammar school is only K to 5, pre-K to 5. The middle school is at a separate institution, but up to 5th grade. So the 5th grade graduation, the pastor had chosen to take his vacation that week. And they asked me to come and celebrate the graduation Mass for the school, which I was honored to do, and I gladly did. So really, this conference gave me a lot of fuel going forward, and just kind of being vocal about this. So the email to the bishop ended up coming back to me as, you should meet with the guy that's kind of the chairman of this task force on education. So it turned into a couple lunches with him, and that evolved into, you should meet our then interim superintendent, Steve Perla, with whom I've struck up a great friendship, I think, and a great working relationship over the last year. And earlier this spring, the bishop called me and said, I need you to come into my office to talk about a few things. And, it was over 90% of what he does is over the phone. So when he calls you in, something's up. And I went in, he said, I have 2 favors I need to ask you, which he never really asked you a favor. That probably means you're walking out of his office with a new job. And one of them was, I'm putting together, as a result of this task force, a Catholic school board for the diocese. And I want a few priests on it, and I want you to be one of those priests. And I said, gladly. And he said, additionally, there's 2 parishes, one of them with a school, that I'd like you to become the pastor of for July 1st. And I said, okay. I mean, I wasn't really looking for a move out of this, but he knew that I was committed and dedicated to Catholic schools. And so this, just this past July 1st, I moved and started my new parish. The school is ripped apart for a thorough cleaning right now. All the desks are in the hallways, and we have students and some alumni of the school that are coming back and just simply putting a new coat of paint on the walls and re-waxing the floors and things along those lines. And I've had some initial meetings with the principal looking ahead to next year. A lot of it is still very new to me, but I'm excited going forward, knowing that at least taking what I learned here and speaking up about it and bringing it to the bishop, bringing it up at the diocesan level, made some kind of difference. And I'm not just speaking about it for me personally, because I think just kind of on the whole, the mentality that had kind of been accepted of priests want nothing to do with schools was dispelled. The idea that there are some priests that want nothing to do with schools is real, but it's not universal. And I think applying it universally as if priests not only don't want to do anything with schools, but also don't have the capacity to do anything with schools because they're too busy or too outstretched with their time, was immediately dispelled. I mean, I know in my previous assignment on Cape Cod, the parish was basically a retirement community. And if the school wasn't there, I wouldn't have anything to do all day, And truly, I mean, there was funerals and there was a school, and that was basically my life. And obviously the school brought a lot more joy to my days than celebrating funerals. But it truly made a difference. Really, kind of solidified the commitment that was in my heart initially for schools, to really want to be a part of the mission going forward, and really the new direction that our diocese as a whole is taking with Catholic education under the leadership of our bishop and our new superintendent, which and based on his comments earlier, I'm just very edified to see encouragement of priests working in schools and the desire to continue to maintain as strong of a priestly presence in those schools as possible.
Wonderful. So you all have a job now. And we have, among the 3 years that we've done this, we've had representatives now of probably 45 dioceses. So that's the ripple effect, Reagan's idea of trickle-down economics. It does work, actually. And I think Father Chris is a good example of how it can work. All right, well, let's head over to the seminary for lunch. And we have a luncheon speaker, Mary Pat Donahue, who's going to talk about classical curriculum. Okay?